Hello, and welcome to this lecture on corporate presentation technique. What we want to talk about today are some do's and don'ts of making effective oral presentations in the corporate environment. So I want to begin with a thought from communication theory. When communication happens between human beings, you have a sender and you have a receiver. Now, when you're communicating with your friends, normally the two of you are going to be of a mind that the sender is responsible for the message being sent and the receiver is responsible for how that message is received. So if your friend says something to you that you don't quite understand, you're going to stop them. And you're going to say, hey, what was that? Or did you mean this? Or did I misunderstand this? I mean, something is going to happen. As you give them feedback to say, I'm not sure I quite got that. Could you run that by me again? And that's the notion of the receiver taking responsibility for properly receiving the message, and the sender then just has responsibility for properly sending the message. Now, in the corporate communication environment, that's not the way things work as a general rule. As a general rule, the sender is not only responsible for sending the message properly, but the sender is also responsible for how the receiver receives that message. Now, let me just illustrate with a couple of examples. If you're in a store and a salesperson is trying to sell you something, or maybe they're coming to your door, or they meet you out on the street and they go, hey, want to buy a whatever. It's obvious to you, I think, that they are responsible not only for properly sending the message, but for getting you to care about receiving it, and for getting you to properly understand what they're sending, because you don't care, probably. And so if they've got any chance for this being effective communication, they've got to control both ends of that. They've got to not only be good about sending, but they've got to be really, really good about making sure that you're receiving what they're sending, and that that communication, effective communication, is happening. If it's no different in the corporate world when one company is making a presentation as a vendor, let's say, to a potential purchaser of a product or a service. A second example here is similar to the first, when a vendor is making a presentation to a potential corporate client about a product or a service. The vendor not only has to properly communicate what the product is going to do, what its advantages are, why it's of value to the customer, but the vendor has to do it in such a way that he knows the customer is getting the important ideas. So, given that as a background, one of the things that we want to make you better at, competent at, in the corporate world is how to communicate in such a way that you are not only being good about transmitting the message, but that you're being very good about making sure that the person that you're talking to or the group that you're talking to is receiving that message just the way you want it received. All right, so let's begin by probably changing some things that you have been taught in public speaking. I don't know where you took a previous course in public speaking. Could have been at a community college, it could have been at this university, it could have been somewhere else. But a previous course in public speaking is a prerequisite for this course, so I'm assuming you had one. So Public Speaking 101, or whatever the number of it was, they taught you probably several things in that course that we're going to undo a bit in this course. For instance, they may have taught you that it's in your best interest to dress up, kind of like I am now, jacket and a tie, or at least a really nice shirt, when you're making your presentation because you want to present a good impression, or whatever words the instructor used to talk to you about that. Although there are times when it's appropriate and probably recommended to wear a jacket and a tie for men or a suit for women when making a presentation in the corporate world, those times are few and far between. And interestingly enough, normally the higher placed the person is in the hierarchy, the less you will want to dress up. I know that sounds counterintuitive. But for instance, if you're called in to make a presentation to your CEO or to one of the other senior officers in the corporation, mostly you won't want to wear a jacket and a tie. All right, so let me step off camera and readjust a bit. Okay, so I've casualed down a bit in my dress. Open collar. I might even be wearing a golf shirt. That would be oftentimes quite appropriate. Even roll my sleeves up some. But I wasn't too precise about it, so it doesn't look like I spent hours doing it. I'm purposefully trying to present a casual air about the presentation. Why would we want to do that? Aren't we concerned that we might be risking projecting an image that we don't care, or we're not serious, or whatever? Actually, no, the opposite is true. If you're going to show up casual and confident, that is going to project a notion of competence. That's going to project this image in the receiver's mind that you're in control, that you're relaxed, and it helps them be relaxed. Secondly, if I wear a jacket and a tie, I've erected a psychological barrier between you and me. I'm making a statement that says, this is a special situation and I'm doing my best to look different and better. And even though that might not be consciously processed by the person you're presenting to, it's subconsciously processed. And so they'll be a little less willing to interact with you, to maybe ask a question partway through the presentation if they don't understand something. And if they're reticent, if they're hesitant to interact with you, that's going to impede the communication. That's going to hamper your effective communication. So you want to be casual. The other thing you want to do is you want to stay in the middle. You don't want to be off to the side, standing at a podium, reading a presentation. That's terrible style. You want to be out in the middle of the room, out in front of, if you have PowerPoint slides or whatever, but out in front of the audience. And usually walking around a bit, moving so that there's, now you can move too much, but I'm just saying, don't act like somebody nailed your feet to the floor. Because that tends to draw away from putting the audience at ease, and that's my point. You want to do the things that are going to put your audience at ease, make them feel relaxed, make them feel comfortable. And you might say, and I want to do that with a CEO when I go make a presentation to a CEO. You know what? I've been a CEO, and I've made lots of presentations to CEOs, and I've worked with lots of different CEOs, and I know what I'm talking about. Yep, you want to be casual. I remember one time I was at the White House making a presentation to one of the cabinet members, the director of OMB. And I made the mistake, I didn't understand this principle back then. I made the mistake of coming in all dressed up. I was kind of nervous, as you might expect, trying to make a presentation on a political issue of concern to one of the folks who was going to be running for president. And the guy, I mean, he could tell that I was too formal. And he just sort of stopped me right at the beginning of the presentation, asked me a bunch of questions, put me at ease, talked about things we weren't even talking about, sort of calming down the situation because he didn't want to get a formal presentation. He wanted to communicate. When I was in the Army, I worked for, at one point, I worked as an aide-de-camp to a general who, when he was at the Pentagon, he worked for another general, a 2 or 3 star, I don't know at the time. And the Congress, when they would ask Department of Army to make a presentation about some project or initiative or whatever they wanted to have information about, they would often ask for this particular general to come over and make the presentation. Well, that's a big deal if you happen to be an Army general. The more time you get to spend developing relationships with congressmen, probably that will have some influence on your promotability in the future. So some of the other generals cornered him one day and said, "How come they're always asking you to come over and make the presentation?" And he says, "Well, let me tell you my secret. When you guys go over to make a presentation, you have," and back in those days we didn't have PowerPoints and computers that you could make presentations with. They used those flip charts, those big flip charts where you have all written out on a page. When you're done with the page, somebody flips the page over and then you're talking to the next page. They said, when you guys go make the presentation, what you're doing is you're standing at attention, you have your little pointer, the way they taught us to do at West Point. I didn't know this, I went to West Point. Okay, and you're sitting there flipping line by line as you move through the chart, sort of at attention. And when you get to the bottom, you flip that page, or your aide does, and you continue on down this way. And this general was saying that's not effective communication, because these congressmen are sitting there, they're sort of a mind, let's not disturb the guy, he's on a roll, he's got his thing to say. And if you say something they don't understand, they're likely not to interrupt you. And so you get all the way done and you think you've done a great job, and you say thank you very much, and you pick up your flip chart and off you go, and you're out of there, and very little communication happened. Now when I go over to Congress and make a presentation, I have my staff prepare the presentation just like your staffs do. But what I do before I go over there is I'll go to the first page and I'll rip it off right in the middle. And then I'll take some masking tape and tape it back. And then take a marker and write over the masking tape to write in. I'm not actually changing the content a bit. I'm just messing it up. Then I'll go to the next page and I'll scratch out a word, and then I'll write exactly the right word up above it, and maybe I'll take another piece of paper and hand write over some of those words in not as nice font as my staff would have written, and just take the thing over exactly. So I'm not making a single change to the content. I'm just sort of reducing the formality a bit. The way I carry myself, I'm not going to stand at attention when I talk to these congressmen. I pull up a chair, put a leg up on the chair, or sit down on the edge of a desk and unbutton my jacket and just sort of be casual there. And we end up having some great conversation. And I ask a lot. I said, any questions here about this first bullet before I move on? Anybody wondering how this might affect constituents in their district or anything? I mean, do we want to talk about this? And we have this discussion that I make sure that we have, so that I've addressed all of their concerns before I go on to the next page. And that way they don't feel like, oh, you know what? This guy's got a show that he's doing, and we just got to let him go. Instead, we have effective communication. And that's why they're always asking me to come back over there. Now, there's a lesson in that for us in the corporate world. You can be too casual. I am not advocating that if you're going to go talk to the CEO, that you wear some t-shirt that's got a couple of holes in it and some sort of nearly obscene message written across the front. That's not what I'm advocating. But I am saying probably you don't want to be wearing a jacket and a tie. And you do probably want to have an open collar, and you want to concentrate on letting these folks be relaxed. It will also relax you, and it will improve their receptivity. It'll also improve the interchange. They're more likely going to stop and ask you questions, and that's very important in a presentation. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to go to a set of lessons that I've observed my students doing over the years that are bad things to be doing when you're making a presentation. So we have some PowerPoint slides that we're going through, and the title of this presentation is Examples of What You Don't Want to Do. So let's just talk about some of these. Now, first of all, you might notice the background that I've chosen for this presentation. It's actually bad. Okay? Whoever picked this presentation background was going, hey, let's do something that looks really fancy. That's probably not good. You don't want to do really fancy. Because you're trying not, you really want to keep this in mind, you don't want to attract attention to the format of your presentation. You want to attract attention to the ideas, to the content in your presentation. So, this first bullet here, flashy backgrounds tend to distract from your credibility. Now that's another thing that you need to understand. The more senior the audience in the corporate world, the more they're concerned with your credibility, the more they're concerned with the question, does this guy know what he's talking about? Is this somebody we can entrust with a project and some funding and expect that he's going to do good things with that? So they're concerned about your credibility, and if you're there to put on a flashy, colorful show, you're sending the wrong message. You're basically saying, hey, I'm all about appearance and I'm not about substance, and that's a bad message. All right, the next example that I have on this first slide, which is a bad example, is, you can read it, or maybe you can't. It says font that's too small to read because you want to cram a lot of words in the short space you have on your side, on your slide. See, I can't read it, it's so small. That's generally a bad idea and actually detracts from effective communication, even though you're using a lot of words to describe precisely the concept you intend to communicate, although wordiness is generally perceived out of place in a slide presentation and therefore actually works against your cause. It's supposed to say cause. I've seen students make this mistake before. They want to make sure they get the words exactly right that they're supposed to be saying, and so they write out everything on the slide that they're intending to say. Bad plan. We'll talk more about that later. But the point that I'm trying to make right here is you don't want to use font that's too small. Sometimes when you try and cram too many things on a slide, you're sort of forced into making the font small to get it all to fit. If you see that happening, use multiple slides. Okay, the third bullet on here is misspelling words on your slide is usually going to tend to project the impression that you're not competent. There are several misspelled words there, but I just want you to think, if a slide like this appeared in front of a senior management audience in the corporate world, what are you doing to your credibility? What are you saying to them? Now, this may be obvious to you. I just got to say I see this all the time in presentations in this course. Juniors, usually juniors, are making an example presentation and they have these slides with misspelled words. You cannot afford to do that in the corporate world. If you are not sure how to spell all those words, get really friendly with your spell checker. Have somebody else review them ahead of time. But don't have misspelled words on your slide. It sends a really wrong message. Okay, the next slide here, titled More Bad Stuff. Sometimes I'll see students want to put big words in a bullet. And it's interesting how often people want to use big words and they don't use them properly. So if you don't know what the word means, don't use it. Usually a big word, unless it's absolutely necessary, is a bad idea. Use a bunch of smaller words to communicate the same concept. So the example here is using inappropriate big words to attempt to credentialize your presentation only leaves your audience a little confused. What in the world does credentialize mean? I know you don't know because I made it up. Okay, but I've also got to tell you how many times I see big words that are misspelled and it looks like a word somebody made up. It's a bad idea. So big words are probably not in your best interest. Animation can be a good thing. Now, what do I mean by animation? What I mean is that these bullets come up one bullet at a time. You first show the first bullet on the slide, talk about it, and then the second bullet appears when you hit the clicker or the mouse or whatever. And then when you finish talking about that second bullet, the third bullet appears, etc. Why would we do that? The answer is so that you can keep the audience focused on what you're talking about at the moment. If you have several bullets on a slide and you first put the slide up, normally the average viewer is going to read the whole slide first. So since they're going to be reading the whole slide when it first comes up, they're not hearing what you're saying about the first bullet until they're finished reading all the other points. And oftentimes, the first bullet is the most important bullet on the slide, and they really need to hear what you have to say about it. So to improve the communication, one bullet at a time is a good way to do that. Sometimes animation that's too flashy tends to distract from the contents of the presentation. So what am I talking about? Look at that. I mean, is that cool or what? Yeah, it's too cool is the answer. Okay, you might think it looks really neat, but if you're going to attract attention to the actual format of the presentation, guess what they're thinking about? They're thinking about how flashy your presentation is. What are they not thinking about? The ideas that your presentation is all about, that's what they're not thinking about. And you don't want that to happen, presumably. I mean, I would assume that you want to communicate substance and that they're there to talk about substance. And if you're going to distract from that substance by how flashy and neat and colorful your presentation is, probably a bad idea. And at the end of your presentation, you don't want people thinking, wow, that was a really cool presentation. And then somebody says, what was it all about? Well, I don't know, but it was really cool. Okay, you want them to remember the content. You want them walking out of the room, not even crossing their mind whether or not you had a neat presentation. That's not the point. You want them walking out of the room thinking about the ideas that you were there to present and get them to think about. And as a general rule, short bullets are better. So I have some examples here, like this first bullet on this slide is a very long bullet. That's not normally a good bullet to have on a PowerPoint slide. This last bullet is better, where you have a short bullet and then you can elaborate on what you really want them to understand. So the bullet's just sort of a mental placeholder, or ought to be. It shouldn't contain all the information. The information should be coming out of your mouth. The information should be coming out of your eyes and going into their eyes. It's not words written on your slide. I sometimes see students pick interesting, even exciting, or entertaining fonts. And I've got a couple of examples here. Sometimes by making the font too interesting and exciting, that again is going to draw attention to the font. It might even project the wrong message subliminally. In other words, subconsciously, they're going to get the message that you're not to be taken serious. You're just a comic, a comedian up here. Sometimes I have folks think a lot of color is a great idea. Again, the problem with too much color is it's distracting. All right, so we have an example here. You don't want too much color. And then you want to remember, you don't want to attract attention to the presentation. I know you've heard me say that again, again, again. I'm just trying to drive that idea home. Don't attract attention to the presentation. Attract attention to the ideas, to the concept, to the message that you're trying to present. All right, so these are some hints, and we'll talk later in the course about other things that you can be doing to improve the effectiveness of the communication. But these are some thoughts to get you started as you put together PowerPoint presentations, and when you present those in class or either videotaped if you're taking this course online, videotaped. Trying to remember these. Remember these things not to do, and let's see you do the things that I've talked about that are good things to do. All right, thank you for your time.